Great. Thanks. So, my name is Jason Zander. I'm the general manager for Visual Studio. So I run the Visual Studio team at Microsoft, all the engineering work. And I'm here with Matt Carter, who is head of our product management work as well for Visual Studio on the pro side as well. And we're both going to be giving a little bit of talk and things like that as well. We've done a couple of different events here, and this is kind of a combination of some of the information we've shared at events like our PDC conference as well as the TechEd conference that we had last week in Barcelona as well, which is why we're in Europe right now. So just to go over that, we'll just jump into this. We have a couple of demos that we'll go through. The first thing is, I will also tell you that if you want to find the slides, background information, pointers to other material that you might see here tonight, you can find that up on my blog, blogs.msdn.com, Jason Z. And we have a bunch of additional information that you can find up there for all the material that we have. Now, for what we talked about at these couple of conferences, we have a couple of things. First of all, from our perspective, I know that everybody here, you've got a whole bunch of different requirements that are placed on you as developers, right? And you've got new platforms coming along, including things like mobile as well as cloud computing and things like that, being able to do work inside of Office and other things along those lines. In general, I don't know if you're in the same boat as I am, but we want to do more and more features. We're being asked to deliver more and more functionality, and I'm sure you're getting twice as much resources to do it. Yeah, okay, you too, right? So we want to figure out ways that can make that easier. So we did a lot of work in Visual Studio 2008 to go ahead and help out with that. And I don't think this is too big of a surprise. Now, the other thing that we've got coming up is we have new platforms coming through. Like I mentioned, we just announced Windows Azure at the PDC, as well as some other platforms that we got coming out, the Live framework, Mesh framework, things like that as well. And so what we've been doing there, it's not really going to change. And in fact, one of the things that, I don't know if you find this, but I wind up with new folks on my team coming on board. I had to teach them the new code. They had to figure out the new systems and things like that as well. And so being able to understand your code, things continue to get, complicated. And so what we've announced over the last couple of weeks is Microsoft Visual Studio 2010 and .NET Framework 4. And so these are basically the new versions of the products that we're coming out with. We haven't even actually released betas yet. We're in pre-alpha. We've released a CTP, and we'll show you versions of the CTP tonight, so you can kind of see some of the features that we've put into the product. But we're also trying to add a lot of new features that will help with some of these new areas that we have. Now, the fourth things I'm going to cover here, I should mention a couple of things. First of all, at the PDC, and I'll give you links in the slides and stuff so you can actually look at the sessions. At the PDC, we talked about a couple of big themes, and I'll talk about some of these tonight. One of those is enabling many-core platform computing. So if you wind up with lots and lots of cores on your machine, how do you write parallel applications and go against those? In addition to that, we announced Windows Azure, and we'll talk a little bit more about that coming up in a little while as well. The four things that we talked about at TechEd last week, I did the keynote for TechEd EMEA developer in Barcelona last Monday, and we talked about four specific areas, and a lot of this was new material that was not covered before with the PDC. In particular, we've done a whole bunch of work in Visual Studio 2010 around understanding what your code looks like, both from an architecture perspective as well as the content of the code that you have. And we'll walk through some demos on that. In addition to that, we've also gone through and done a bunch of additional work for writing web applications. So if you're using ASP.NET or writing for Silverlight or things like that, we've made a bunch of new investments in 2010 that augment what we did in 2008 in order to make that easier as well. The next area we'll talk about is on the Office side and talking about writing Office business applications and how you might use that, including some new stuff that we've just recently announced that we announced at TechEd last week. And then finally, we also have been making a large investment in the C++ portion of the product as well, for those of you that are writing C++. So these are the areas we're going to drill into tonight, and then we have time, we'll go ahead and do Q&A on anything else you'd like to talk about. Both Matt and I are here this evening for exactly that. So let's go ahead and talk about the understanding the code piece, and Matt, I'll go ahead and hand this one over to you since you're doing the first piece.
So before we get started, how many folks, I know we've got IT pros later on in the evening, but just as a show of hands, how many people in the room are application developers?
Perfect.
How many people are IT pros? We love you guys too. One of the goals that we've been trying to do with Visual Studio, in particular with the Visual Studio Team System product, is make sure that as you're building an application and deploying it, all of the different roles on the team are able to play together. That includes developers and IT pros and testers and architects. As we've been developing the product, we've really tried to say, getting into the product, how do you make sure that we take down the barriers between each of the different roles on the team? Because traditionally, you've had situations where an architect will come up with a fantastic plan for the application. They'll give it to the developer, and they'll kind of scratch their head, and they'll make it work, and they'll do what they do. Then they'll give it to the tester, and the tester will get their hands on it, and they'll find problems in the test cases and whatnot, and then they have to hand it back to the developer. A lot of times, there are challenges where people don't understand what's actually happened to cause an application to run the way it runs. What are the problems that are causing it to crash? And then how do you give the information back to the developer so they can go fix what the tester found there? So what we're really trying to do with the product is kind of answer these three key areas. What does the application architecture look like? So if you're looking at what's in your application, especially complex applications, understanding the relationship between the web server and the database server and the application server and the client so that you know how these things play together. Second of all is how do we know what the tester is finding? A tester goes through the test case and they frequently will find something, give it back to the developer, and then tell me if this sounds familiar. Give it back to the developer responds back, works just fine on my machine. I'm not sure what's wrong with you. So that's not exactly a QA best practice here. And then finally, just understanding what's in the code. When you look at the code in your application, how do you understand what's in there, how the different pieces play together, and just being able to get a good view into something which may be very complex so you understand what makes up your application. So within this, we're really trying to nail these problems on a couple different levels. First one is, how do you understand what goes inside your code? So with Visual Studio Team System in 2010, we're trying to make sure you can look at your application not in sort of a big Visio chart, but how do you deconstruct what's been written before and then look at the relationship between the different components of your applications really easily. And let's look at what are the references in hierarchy, how are things sequenced together, how do you look at the different class dependencies, and how can you visualize it in a way which makes it much more interesting and meaningful for a developer. And then finally, things like code comments. Largely, the application has looked the same, going back to VB1. It's largely the same environment. How do you make sure that we can get code comments to be something which, like what you'd expect from Microsoft Word, where you have the application, you have the document, but then you can add richness on top of that that's meaningful for people who may come to the document after you've gone through it. And then finally, how do you get rid of the dreaded no repro problem? So one of the things we're trying to do here is to make sure it's a lot easier to get a great application development and testing environment that you can use to solve these problems. One of the things that we announced at TechEd was the lab management problem, the Visual Studio Team System lab management product. And what is lab management? Why do we care about this? Well, a couple of things. One is we're finding 30–50% of the time spent in building out in test time is in getting an application environment spun up and then rebuilt. That's a lot of time wasted on just basic blocking and tackling. The second is because of the work that's involved in getting an application up and running, it's hard to test it early on in the process in an iterative fashion. Third is test hardware tends to be underutilized. You tend to have to overbuy to deal with different types of scenarios, which is not a great use of time and money, especially in the current environment. And then finally, we've got that dreaded no repro problem. So again, with VS2010 lab management, it's got these great things, productivity, efficiency, parallelism, great stuff. I'd rather actually show you the product than to talk about the marketing points here. So let me just run through a, I'll run through a video demo of this because my machine is a little too anemic to run Hyper-V, so I apologize for that. So what you see here, this is the lab management environment. So what you see up here is a couple of things that are interesting. If you go through a scenario, you say, okay, we have a test bed. We want to test the zip code validation on an application. So we wanted to get started and say, okay, how do we get the environment set up so we can actually test against it? So you want to spin up what the web server looks like and the database server and also the client. So I'm going to start this here, and you'll see how within the environment, and this is built on top of System Center, you can start your testing and start spinning up the new environment. So you look at what the profile is, basically you name what the thing is going to look like. After you get some of the details filled out, you start looking at what are the virtual machines that we want to be spinning up. So you look at what type of environment you want. So for this example, we're going to be setting up, okay, we need a Windows server with SQL. We need to have a desktop client. We need to have a web server. So what this is doing now is it's going to be spinning up the virtual environments for the 3 tiers of the database application so that you can start doing the test against it in the real environment. So after you get these spun up, the system goes and builds up the application. So you'll see it's actually creating the virtual environments right now. You can see the different ones there. You got Windows XP clients, you got 2008, et cetera. So now we're going to go and run the test script here. The test case, pardon me. So you can see, okay, we're going to test the zip code validation test case. We're going to run the test case. And what you'll see here in the environment, let me just get to a better point here. You'll notice on the left, you've got the test case, which you have the various steps that you need to run your test. So you start your test. This is where it gets really exciting. So as a tester, you want to give great information back to the developer so they can fix a problem. Within lab management, you're actually gathering some really rich information as you go through the test. You can see, action. This is what they call the black box, where it goes through and looks at what's going on inside the application in your environment as you're running the system. Second of all, background. What else is running on the machine that might be causing some anomalies as you're going through the test? And finally, and this is one of the things it's just really simple and cool and elegant. It records a video of screen cam of what's the tester doing as they're going through the environment. What are they clicking on? What are they doing? So that if there's something weird that you can't quite pin down, you can start seeing exactly what was happening as the person was going through it. So as we set up these things, we're going to go and we're going to test the page here. So you can look at the test case on the left. Here's the test steps. First one, open IE on the web server. Okay, so we can go through that, and that's, it's running, so we pass that. Then second, we're going to go and look at, actually load the test page up here so we can start loading the page and test the zip code. So we go type the URL into the field, let it run up, and we're trying to connect. Oh, we got a 404, so it failed the test. So now we're going to want to raise a bug. So we marked that it failed the test. Now we have to go through and raise the bug so we can actually go and give it back to development so they can understand what happened in the test. So we go back in and we raise the bug. What's kind of nice about this is you then go in back into TFS and you set the bug up here. And part of it is that you're actually not just giving the normal information, but you're actually providing a lot of richness that's not normally, that hasn't traditionally been present here. So you fill out the information. This is where it's kind of fun. So you look at the system information. You're actually looking at all three tiers and the environment for each one of the tiers, so you can actually see what's happening at each part of the application when it's not passing the test. And then additionally, you get not only the environment information, but you're getting the video, you're getting all of the steps that are taken in that background information that was specified previously. So as you go through and you get the information ready to go send it back to the developer, you go and you save it, you raise the bug. And now you'll see that in the active bug queue, this bug is now raised to the plug. And again, the information that the tester had delivered is now in the hands of the developer. So they can go and they look at what was the system information, look across all three tiers, what was going on at the time. You see the video, see the background information. Now this works. So you're a developer, you've now gotten a bug, something's not working, so now you have to go and actually address the problem. So what the lab manager does is it actually goes and it's going to revert the environment, all three tiers, back to what the tester was using at the time that they encountered that bug. So using virtual machines, you're then going to be able to go back and say, okay, show me exactly what was going on when the bug was raised. So using the virtual machines, it spins up the various environments, it sets the variables or the environment settings to the same place that it was when they were testing it. You have the different tiers there, and so basically now you're at the same place that tester was when they encountered the problem, so you can go and start fixing it. So again, you go back here and you see that all of these steps are really tightly integrated with a relatively few number of mouse clicks that are doing a tremendous amount of things in terms of setting up the environment, allowing a tester to gather rich information, and then giving that information back to the developer so it's a single process that lets you go and really fix those problems in one process rather than having to go through a lot of iterations about it's not working for me, it's worked for me, et cetera, which is not frustrating and very unproductive. So let me get back to the presentation there. So again, what are we seeing here? Self-serve library machines, being able to let a developer start playing with the type of environment that they might see while they're developing the application. Again, maintaining those baselines so you can start getting back to zero. So after you've actually gone through and fixed the bug, you can then go back to the environment as well without having to do a lot of rebuilds and setting out new hardware procurement. Reducing the setup time. that's easy. I mean, it's on top of System Center, so it's using the power of the infrastructure, but it's just very easy to get these things set up. And then finally, that just getting past that no repro bug, I think is going to be not only great for productivity, but just it makes your team feel like they're more functional together. It lets people work together in a really unified fashion. So, okay, so then I'm going to hand it back to Jason.
Thanks, Matt. So on my team, I have about 400 testers working on Visual Studio itself. So that's just the testers, that's the developers, program managers, and stuff like that as well. As you can imagine, we have like 60-some million lines of code, 40 million lines approximately in C++, another 20 million in C#, and pieces like that. So having a product exactly like this that we can provision our environment, capture all the repro information, and et cetera, we kind of need that, right? If we don't have that, we kind of die. Now, you don't have to have, a team of 1,000 or something like that to actually need, this kind of thing. I think being able to actually get all of the information back and forth as Matt said, really makes that a lot simpler. The one other thing that we didn't show here in the video, but is also present, is historical debugging. So one of the checkboxes that was in there actually records, as you're running the application, all the debugging and trace log events. And so as a developer, a few things. I can look through that list. I can click on a hyperlink into the video that shows the step where it failed. I can double click the LVR, which is what the demo did to get the environment and rerun it. I can also use the historical debugger to actually launch the debugger against what the tester ran and step forwards and backwards through time in order to see, well, what were the states and things like that as well. So I think when you combine all those sort of things together, it makes it a heck of a lot easier to kind of figure out what you're building. Now, with respect to the web tier and the stuff that we've done there, I'm curious, how many people are writing ASP.NET and web applications today? Wow, lots. Excellent, excellent. And how many people are using like Silverlight? Wow. Excellent. Okay, cool. Is anybody using the MVC controller framework? Couple, 3 or 4, MVC? Okay, excellent. So we've made a few different changes that we've done with Visual Studio. Starting in 2008, we did a lot of work in order to enable things like IntelliSense debugging, IntelliSense for JavaScript, for your client-side code, in addition to being able to do debugging for JavaScript as well, and we've introduced a number of things like that. One of the new things that we've added, kind of out of band, but will ship with Visual Studio 2010, is our Model View Controller framework as well, so MVC. Very simple pattern, allows you to, and it's a classic pattern in computer science, it allows you to do good abstraction of your model, which is your data, like your database, for example. Anything you have to do with the business logic, which is the controller, that's the C, and then the view, which is separate from that, that's the V, and I can use HTML or other things like that as well. In addition to that, we've done a whole bunch of other work with JavaScript and deployment and things like that. So what I want to do is we're going to hot swap this over to my other laptop here. Hope that our video cable works. There it goes.
There we go.
Okay.
You're now seeing live code. I get the video. This is the live code here. So,
thank you for jinxing that.
Think good thoughts. I mean, everybody to think good thoughts.
So I can see it there, but not here. That's awesome. Okay, let's see how many ways I can twist myself around here. Okay, so we're going to do this kind of over-the-shoulder coding thing and see how that works, because this doesn't pay. I'm actually running an x61 ThinkPad with Windows Server 2008 and Hyper-V on top of it. So our performance here of the bits is not necessarily indicative of the final product, so I will say that. So this is Visual Studio 2010, and as you would expect, it's got a very similar look and feel. Let me talk about a couple things first. One of the things that we've done with this version, we have actually replaced the editor with a new one that is written in WPF. And in this particular example, there's not too much to see here. I have another demo I can potentially show later, which shows you editor plugins. But we've done this on purpose in order to allow us to use the features in WPF to actually get much more interactive on the display. So we can include, for example, graphics and different formatting and things like that as well. And we had a number of different examples that we've got in the videos and stuff that I can send you a link to. Now, in this particular case, what we've got is a sample application. It's a kind of an e-commerce sort of site here that allows me to kind of view like a food database and something like that and pull that back up. And it uses the Model View Controller pattern that we have right here. And I'm sitting inside of my test case scenario right here. And one of the things that I may wish to do is to start adding a new feature into the system. And how many people are using like test-driven development or an agile methodology? A number of folks. Excellent. Okay. One of the things we did with Visual Studio 2010, or we are doing since this is still a pre-alpha, we've actually tried to enable a lot of agile methodology inside of the system to make it much simpler for you. And so one of the things you might be doing is using like test-driven, for example, in order to be able to write some of your code. So in my case, for example, if I wanted to add a new menu item into the system, like, hey, let's pick the top meals, the most popular ones, or things like that. I've got a database which has the data, that's my model, and I want to be able to pull that back and display it. A way that I might do that inside of the code is to write a controller object on that. And if you're doing a test-driven methodology, one of the things that you'd probably be doing is saying, well, what should the controller look like? Okay, pull that out. Yeah, see, that is great. The pop-up works on the screen, but not over here. Okay, so what I might want to do is type in top meals, let's say controller. Okay, and I'm going to hit the escape key off of that. And that doesn't exist yet. We'll call that controller. And we'll do top meals controller on that as well. Okay. And that thing doesn't actually exist just yet. Let's scroll over so we can see a little bit. I've made the font larger so it's easier to see on screen. And so I want to create a new one of those. Well, once I get the results back, I need to essentially take the results and with the view results, we need to be able to go back and grab the content off of that. So go back and we'll grab the controller object. And I'm going to call an index method, which would allow me to essentially get all the data back from that I kind of care about. Okay, so I'm kind of happy with this kind of code. Now, I might actually write a number of lines of code here, right? And what I'm really doing is saying, look, I want a controller that's going to allow me to go grab that data from the database. This is a good way to do it. I'll construct an object for it, and I'll call a method to go get it. I'll retrieve the value back, and then when I get the view results, I can turn around and take that and display it in some fashion. But the code doesn't actually exist yet. And so what we've done here is we've introduced inside of the box just the ability to do a number of default things. I'm going to hit Control Dot. And we've got our refactoring pieces built right in. So I can, for example, go ahead and create the class right here in line if I would like. In my case, I'm going to go ahead and click Create Other. And that allows me to kind of go pick, hey, where would you like to actually locate this? And I can pick the project location that I'd like, and I'm going to pick Dinner Now, which is my core project, as opposed to the test project. And just to get it kind of set up right, I'm going to put it in the controller's sub-project right here. And I'll go ahead and click OK. Now what that's going to do is go ahead and create the controller class itself and fault it in for me. And that means that that part of the code is running fine, but now I have this index method, which of course doesn't exist. So I'm going to go ahead and fault that code in. It's a little bit hard to read on this display. Okay, and so now I've been able to fault in both pieces of the code that I'm interested in. Now another thing that we've done in this version of the product is we've introduced snippets. If I click Test and hit Tab on that, and I'll show you snippets in a little bit, but we've made it a lot easier inside of the code to have snippets of code. And it's a snippet manager, but we've plugged it into a number of different areas. So this code is now pretty straightforward. Go grab a controller, go grab the results from the controller, so that will query the database and pull it back, grab the view data, and then in my case, since I'm writing a test case, I want to actually assert that I get 9 items out of here. So I've made sure that the particular item is going to return exactly 9 by the time I get back. Now, because I'm doing test-driven development itself, one of the things that I want to do is go ahead and do the testing right away. So we'll right-click on this. I'm going to say Run Tests. And so it's going to compile up our test case itself and go ahead and execute it. And let that kind of launch. Surprisingly, it's not doing too bad on my laptop. Okay, so it's in it, and then it failed. And this is on purpose, of course, because I'm doing test-driven. So the first thing I want to do is write my test case and make sure that it actually fails when the assert condition is wrong. Now, I can hover over that and decide, well, why exactly did it fail? Well, I don't know, let's see. It's not implemented. Okay, that makes sense. We just wrote the code. So if I double-click on it, you can see that, sure enough, I've created the controller's class. I've created the index with the view result piece and things like that as well. And by default, it throws back the not implemented, so I can go off and do the testing itself. Now what we need to do is we need to actually add the code. I'm going to use a snippet for that. And as you can see, this is just using a link query, declaring a database context and pulling back all the data here and taking the top 9, which is why we could do the assert before and say, yeah, I expect to have exactly 9 items that will come back from that from before. Now, in order to make this code work, though, I'm in the wrong class. I need to actually make this inherit from controller, because that's what it is. Okay, and so I've got this guy inheriting from controller. Sorry. Thank you. That's the danger of typing at a 30-degree angle. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to make this inherit from controller. And this is another part of refactoring that I kind of like. I want to inherit from controller itself. If I hit Control dot on this, I can say, well, you don't actually have that. Would you like to go ahead and do the using? Which goes ahead and pulls it back in, and then that resolves the reference, and now my application is basically got the right kind of context. So that basically helps me get the right kind of stuff in here. Now, the next thing I need to do, though, is I do need to go ahead and add a view, because now I've got the logic and the database behind it, but I want to go add a view inside of here. Here it is. I'll have to go ahead and just take the default on here. So I've done the query, I've got the data, I got the view result, but I have not actually done anything with the display yet. And by adding a view, I'm saying, hey, I'd like to go ahead and display this thing. Now we're sitting inside of the basically the HTML, the ASMX, sort of piece that we've got here. And I'm able to do a couple of things here. I mentioned snippets. One of the things I've found is that people that are working with HTML, JavaScript, and stuff like that, our WYSIWYG designers are cool. You can drag things out, and that's kind of nice. I also know that a lot of you are very proficient with HTML and JavaScript directly. And one of the things you'd love to be able to do is just sit in the editor and kind of make that environment work and not necessarily have to go out every time. And so we have added, as I mentioned, I can, for example, right-click. I can insert snippet, and we've done HTML snippets in this version. So if I go off to HTML, for example, and hit enter on that, I can kind of scroll through all of the different types that I have available. Here, for example, is a table. If I hit enter on that guy, it'll actually go off and launch, then put the whole thing in there. Now, I also know that if you're kind of like me, okay, that's great, but I don't necessarily always need to have the keyboard there. So if I just type in table and hit tab, I get the same thing, right? Which is kind of cool. So I mean, if you're familiar with HTML, if you're familiar with all these sort of things, just type in the keyword, hit tab, right? I mean, it'll kind of expand, and you can kind of get it going. And of course, all the normal visual views and stuff like that work as well, which makes it pretty straightforward. But yeah, you kind of get the idea off of that. Okay, now there's a couple of things I want to do here. First of all, I need to have the view code in here, so I've actually got another snippet in here, and we'll look at that in a second. The second thing I need to do, and this is just for the sake of time, I've got some of these kind of predefined to make it a little bit easier. So we'll do the search bar as well, and put that guy in here. And all it's doing is putting a new menu item at the top of the page, and this is giving me a div where I can display these menu items and stuff like that as well. And you can see that it's basically just going through and doing a for each and pulling those back and now displaying in ASP.NET. So now I got my HTML view that's going to come back on top of that as well. And so that works pretty good. Now, I think that the next thing I would like to do, though, is I would like to actually put some script code behind that, because that's a pretty typical display. So we can create a new div on here. And I might want to do a script. Let's go ahead and script and click tab on here. And as you can see, I get my kind of script area on here. One of the other things that we've done for Visual Studio 2010 is we also recognize that people want to be able to use toolkits and libraries and stuff like that. And so we are shipping the jQuery framework with Visual Studio 2010. It's a very popular, and we didn't go off and invent our own. We worked with the jQuery team, which is, of course, not part of Microsoft. It's an open source kind of project. And we're incorporating that into the system itself. And so, for example, in this project that I've created, I'll pull our project view over so that you can actually see it a little bit better. But here I have all the jQuery files and stuff included right inside of that. And that's pretty cool, because now I can go ahead and write the project against it. How many people are using jQuery out of curiosity? Okay, yeah, that's a lot of folks. That's probably about 25% or so of the team itself. Yeah, and so we work, the jQuery guys, they've been great on this sort of stuff, which has been awesome. Now, within here, the other nice thing that we've done, I mentioned we've done IntelliSense for JavaScript, and we did that in 2008. Now, we've made some performance improvements and a couple of other things, because the feedback on that was quite good. But if you're going to be using jQuery, I think one of the other things that you would love to be able to do is actually have, some kind of IntelliSense for it. So if I just hit the $ left banana, then you see I'm actually pulling up the jQuery IntelliSense work. If I were to go ahead and click a particular document right here, I can type in, put in something else right here, and do a func or whatever. But essentially, I can go through and get the full IntelliSense experience for the jQuery library itself as well. All right, so what I'm going to do here is I'll insert one more snippet, which is some code that I have for jQuery. Oops, sorry. Messed them up. There it goes. And so you can see here that what I've done is we've written a function on this using jQuery. And what it does is basically do the kind of fade to slow sort of thing, that sort of thing, which is a fairly common effect that one might want. So let me go ahead and pull this guy off to the side, and I will go ahead and up here, I will make dinner now. Oops, let's go over here. All right, let's go ahead and set this as the start project. And I'm going to go ahead and hit the F5 button. And let's see how good of a job I did typing in all of that code. So with this, we've done all the refactoring pieces. We've done all the jQuery work inside of it. We've done a model. We used the model. We did a controller that we introduced from scratch. And we also pulled back and added a view on top of it. So all these things coming together then wind up adding that new feature onto the site. Let's see if we get this guy up here with my top meals. Yeah, it's doing the top one, and it's thinking on my little laptop here. Now I'm running a web server on top of my x61, so tons and tons of fun. So by pulling back all of these things, we're able to add the new features on board, pull back the model, pull back the view, pull back the controller, all the rest of that kind of work on top of it. And those are a couple of things. I'll let this thing kind of run here in the background because I think you get the idea of how we do this. Let's do a stop debugging on top of that. Now, the one other thing that I do want to show you here is the ability to do deployment work, because I don't know if you've ever had this happen to you before. Have you ever accidentally deployed a website with your tracing turned on? No, that's just me. Oh, it's me and him. What's your name? Okay, sorry. All right. So just us, we've accidentally done that. But if you've ever visited like an ASP.NET site and you buy something, and then all of a sudden it catches an exception, and you get the full call stack, and it's like, oh, so that's how your shopping cart works. That's awesome, right? Now, that's not exactly something that you're going to be proud of having that happen. So one of the things we've done for deployment, if I right-click here, I can add a config transform. And what that does on my web config is it gives me a release and a debug version. Now, if I double-click the debug guy here right away, you can see that the first thing, well, this one's kind of wide open, so it doesn't have a lot of stuff in it. If I double-click the release version, you can see I've added a transform, and it does this for me automatically. I want you to remove the debug attributes, right? So when you actually create the package, I actually don't want you to, I want to strip them. I don't want them in there, right? I mean, and I don't want to have to go crawl through, what turns out to be sometimes really huge web config files and hierarchies and, blah, 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 and all the rest of that kind of junk kind of becomes a problem. Now, we've done a few things in here. You can do your own web config, kind of transforms on here as well. And so, for example, I've got another one in here I can do. Let's do an insert snippet on here so you don't have to watch me type too much backwards and sideways. This is an example that says, hey, go ahead and take the connection string, and when you get the connection string done, I want you to replace it with this one, right? Because that way you don't have to worry about people accidentally putting multiple connection strings in the wrong files and stuff. It's like, no, every time you see one, I'd like to be able to replace that thing. And so I can do very simple transforms on here. I can do XDT, and I can do, hey, I want you to go ahead and do a transform. When you get the transform on here, the transform I want is a replace. And if I do an XDT on location, okay, then I can basically say, hey, I want you to go ahead and replace the name. And if you match on top of the name, so we can do I guess we'll do a match on name. And this is very simple syntax, but it says, look, if you ever see the name, which is this dinner now connection string, I want you to replace it with this guy. Okay, so that's going to save you a whole bunch of problems. What we've done with this, if I go up to project and go up onto the deployment piece of this, yeah, this is really hard to see. Okay, here. We'll go up to the property page on this. And one of the things you see is we've added publishing for SQL and publishing over here as well. I can now create packages right inside of the tool that allow me to say, look, these are the components I want to be deployed with. These are my IIS settings that I'd like to have. This is how I'm going to deploy this particular project. And so, for example, I can go up here on Create Publish Settings, and I can say New. I'd like to create a new one, and now I can actually go through. We have all of the, I haven't specified the name yet, but I can call this Dinner Now. And with that, I can kind of go down here. I can publish on all FTP and other sort of sites and stuff like that. I have a publish button, et cetera. So when you're testing, you can run these transforms. So now when I do the build, it's going to go build it. It's going to go run those transforms, strip or replace and stuff like that, create the packages for deployment. If I'm doing my own testing as a developer, I can just do one-click deployment right here from inside of the tool. If I'm working with an operations environment, my IT staff, I can give them, like, the nightly builds will kick these things out. Everything nice and cleaned up and stuff like that, and I can go hand that off. Okay, so these are basically some of the new features that we've added inside of 2010. Let me switch back over to the high-level machine here. Okay, and so we kind of covered with the demo all these sort of things, the IntelliSense and jQuery, model view controller and stuff like that. And you can play with the MVC framework right now. We have made that work out of band on 2008. A lot of the new features you're seeing here are part of 2010. When we usually do out-of-band releases, then we grab those and we stick those into the next major version that we have. Now, the next area that we talked about that I'll go through here is working with Office and writing business applications and things like that. Is anybody using SharePoint? Okay, excellent. Would you like to have Visual Studio for SharePoint? Yes, we do have Visual Studio for SharePoint. So that's something else that we're adding inside of Visual Studio 2010. And it works the way you should expect, right? I mean, the key thing for me and my team, if you learn a language, C#, Visual Basic, take your pick, whatever your favorite language is, and you learn .NET programming skills, here's how the libraries work and those sort of things, et cetera, as well as Visual Studio as a tool, once you're comfortable with that, whether it is rich client applications, the web, Silverlight, or whatever, those skill sets will translate automatically into whatever new platform you have. If you're doing consulting and you actually work for a new group and they want you to go use the cloud, guess what? The same thing works. Same thing for SharePoint. What I found with SharePoint is it's a great environment. If you're going to write custom parts for it, you better really love XML and GUIDs. I don't know if everybody's ever written the parts, right? I mean, you can create the control pattern, you can stitch it all together. Unfortunately, it reminds me a little bit of trying to write COM, in the olden days, trying to get all your class factories lined up and that kind of stuff. So what we've done for this version is you can now do File, New Project, SharePoint, and get a SharePoint project. We have a SharePoint Explorer, which means you can connect to it just like you can with your databases, just like with the Architecture and Server Explorer. I can connect to it, I can look at the lists, I can look at all the event receivers, all the normal stuff that you have. You can actually go ahead and import from an existing WSP file in order to create your existing templates. We have the ability to hook up to lists in one line of code. We've written class libraries that when you, I just declare an SP list and I attach it to the current SharePoint instance, grab the SharePoint list back, I can now program against it using .NET, which means I can also use link against it. So if you like writing link expressions, you can actually write link against SharePoint lists as an example. And then adding new support in for things like event receivers and work like that, it's as simple as going to the project on the list. You right-click the list that you've attached to and say add event receiver, and boom, I can say anytime something's deleted, this code should run. And now I can just go ahead and type it out. It's no different than going in and double-clicking, for example, a control on a form and writing code behind it. And now everything like that basically just works. And the final thing we did do here as well is we've added a package explorer similar to what I showed with IIS, which means that you can, as you're adding all these new components, event receivers, workflow initiation, all the typical things you'd write with SharePoint, those things automatically start building a package deployment framework, and they describe where the parts are and where they'll get combined together. And so now when I do the F5 thing, I kick out a build, just like I would with a website, and I can go ahead and deploy that with SharePoint itself. And so I think the best feedback that I've gotten from customers as we've showed this to them is like, it works like it's supposed to. It's like, yes, it does, exactly. That's exactly what you want. That tells me we're on the right track because it's very consistent and it's very easy to go use. So this is a new feature of 2010. We only announced this last Monday at TechEd. It's the first time we've actually showed it. And there are actually demos online that actually walk through probably half an hour worth of material of here's how it works and all the rest of it. So I think that's actually a pretty exciting new piece of functionality that we have. Now, the next thing that I wanted to talk about, and I wanted to try and leave a little bit of time for like Q&A and stuff like that before the break, is C++. And I'm curious, how many folks are working with C++ as well? You got a couple of folks. Okay. Yeah, we got a couple of folks in there. Okay, great. So one of the things we've done for C++, and this will also cover a couple of other technologies as well, we've realized that we've got a lot of people, like I have a ton of code. Like I said, I got like 40 million lines of code inside of Visual Studio itself, as well as the .NET framework and pieces like that. And what we've done with this version is we spent a lot of time working on trying to make the system scalable. We've added quick searching across, C# and Visual Basic. We've also added in C++. We've done a whole bunch of stuff with IntelliSense and code refactoring work like that as well to try and make that much simpler to go figure out. So we really do want to make sure that we have a first-class experience for everybody writing in managed code. Let me tell you about one other new piece of work that we're doing. I mentioned before parallel computing. At this point, even my X300 ThinkPad has 2 cores in it. Right, the typical machines that are coming out right now that you can go off and purchase, they're going to have a ton of cores, right? Intel, AMD, or hardware manufacturers are putting a lot of that work out there. So the next question for us is, how are we going to take advantage of that, right? Which is both for a managed and an unmanaged side. Well, we've done a few things in the new release in .NET Framework 4 and Visual Studio 2010. We've introduced a new set of libraries that allow you to take advantage of that parallel compute power. A couple of different things. First of all, we have the resource manager here, which allows us to do scheduling against the cores on your machine. Okay, and beyond that, we have both a unmanaged stack that's shown in orange on this particular display on the right-hand side, and we have a managed stack on the left-hand side as well. So if you're writing in C++, you can, for example, use the PPL, the parallel pattern libraries, to write against that. If you're writing in managed code, then you can use, for example, plink. And if you're using link already, what if you could actually write something that says, look, I want to go sort or search through the following data? Well, you know that by default, that closure will run against one core. We've made it as simple as saying as parallel as an extension on that, and we'll automatically go distribute up your query by breaking apart the expression, and we'll schedule it for you on the other cores in the machine, which is really straightforward. So I really like that. So for example, the demo that I did at TechEd, which is also online so you can see it, I actually took a Pong application, because we were showing it first in MFC, it works also over here, and we ran a Pong ray tracing application. You know Pong, the old video game, right? The first visual kind of guy. And of course the ray tracing algorithm, quite slow, and doesn't work incredibly well. Ray tracing typically has like an outer loop and an inner loop, and you're tracing every pixel on the screen, so it's very compute intensive. With using this, in this case we did a parallel for keyword in C++, because it could also be the peeling version. By changing that syntax, it makes the outer loop say, for each core, do the following work, and the inner loop can then go execute. So, of course, we had to run it on an 8-way machine. So we were playing Pong on an 8-way machine on stage, which was kind of nice, so we could show all the CPUs basically bouncing along the way, which is a lot of fun. So this environment is also available, CTPs, you can download it and play with it and stuff like that as well. This is the framework and runtime side. In order for you to take advantage of that, I think you also want some tools. And so on the profiling side, we've added a couple of new things. I apologize for the eye chart here, but at a top level, you can kind of get the feeling. This display at the bottom is showing me, as my application ran, how well was it using the cores that are available on my machine. The grid down here, for example, is showing me the usage across all these items, and then the legend tells me, am I blocked or things like that. So when a particular thread of execution across the top is red, it means I'm sitting there. I'm in a lock. I'm in a mutex. Take your pick. I'm not doing anything. Green is actually running. I've actually used this on Visual Studio. Right? We do dog food our own products. So one of the first things I did once we got this into the build is I actually ran the profiler against devm.exe, which of course is our application name. And it was kind of sad because I saw 16 threads running, and a bunch of it's red, and I can actually see the green jump from thread to thread to thread, and it's like, guys, what the heck are we doing? We got all these threads kicked off, and we're using this one then and this one. It's like, this doesn't make any sense. So we're actually using the tool ourselves. But this view allows you to kind of see which threads are blocking and how they were scheduled. We've also worked on the debugger. And so if you schedule a ton of threads, like say you have 100 threads of execution that are kind of running for you in that particular example, well, you're not going to want to go through a thread window that literally has hundreds to thousands of items in it. So we've added viewers on top of it. This one allows you to see which tasks are running and doing what. And this is actually what we call a cactus stack debug stack view. What this is saying is, look, I have 5 tasks that are all in the same chunk of code right now. Like where they're stopped in the top of the frame, the call stacks match. All 5 tasks are in the same piece of code, so I'm done. I have one task that actually made a call down to the p.d method over here, so I'm showing that separate. I have 3 tasks that have actually made it all the way to p, m, and o, and then off of that 2 more down here. So it's a way to scale with having tons and tons of cores running and executing, so you can kind of manipulate which threads you're looking at, how you look at the contents, and things like that as well. So these are part of Visual Studio 2010 as well, and they're available with the CTP that we've got. So the last thing that we did, this is actually a picture Matt took at Tech Ed EMEA. We've actually enabled multi-touch on Windows 7. And so we were a little bit nuts, right? Because what we did is we took pre-alpha versions of Visual Studio, and we did really dangerous stuff like going into the editor like I did tonight and hitting enter, and seeing what would happen. And of course, I set that up, and the first thing it did was crash. That was the first demo on stage. It crashed. We restarted. It was the only crash that we had, thankfully. So everything was fine. But as we went through the end, we got really nuts at the end, and we took a pre-alpha version of Windows 7 with our pre-alpha version of Visual Studio and stuck them on the same team. And we ran this demo, including the CPU and everything else that we did on there. And I actually upgraded this MFC application, the Pong app, to have a ribbon, and MFC, multi-touch, 3D with parallel and stuff like that. And then we ran it on Windows 7, which is a touch screen. So the reason you see my hands kind of over the top there is we're literally playing touch by capturing the WM touch move message that comes out of Windows in order to grab both components. So that was a great experiment. I wasn't sure it was going to work because the night before we had the 8-way machine open on the floor behind the stage, and we were pulling out the video card because every time you ran the mouse over something, it would actually crash. So we put a new video card in and crossed our fingers, and it worked kind of fine. So it's mostly just really early in where we're at. Now the multi-touch support for Windows 7, we've done a bunch of other work in 2010 for targeting Windows 7 itself. Windows 7, as you know, is not yet in beta, but it will be at some point. It's a great release. Multi-touch is a good example of features you can add. In this particular demo, I've actually done it with C++ and MFC. We've also enabled multi-touch for all of our managed code offerings as well. So if you're using WPF, Silverlight, things like that, then you should expect to be able to get that, and it'll go the normal way. Like in this case, we did a WM touch move message handler. In a managed code, you'd have an event handler in the same way that you'd have like double click or resize, or it'll work exactly the way that you would kind of expect. So that's the new platform support that we have coming out. And the SharePoint stuff, of course, is looking at a future version of Office as well. So that's all the powers that we've got here, and I kind of walked through these already. So that's basically the 4 major pillars and content that we have kind of gone through. And I won't reread through all of these. Let me also talk a little bit about some of the other big announcements that we made at PDC. One of the new offerings that we've done is we've always had excellent stacks on premise. So Windows Server, System Center, you're familiar with all of these products. An announcement that we made at PDC is Windows Azure, which is a new version of Windows that's designed to run for the cloud and for cloud workloads. Now, Windows Azure itself, you basically don't ever provision this yourself. You acquire an account from Microsoft, and I can actually just talk through it through a management portal and things like that. On top of it, we've built several things. First of all is Live Services, which is a normal set of Microsoft Live Services, uses Atom Pub as the kind of dispatch mechanism, but you also have JavaScript libraries and .NET, et cetera, and things like that. .NET Services takes a lot of the kind of identity and things like that we've done with WCF and says, hey, wouldn't you like .NET in the cloud? And like think of it this way: if I could just log on, when I log into Active Directory, I don't have to log in again. It just kind of works through my enterprise. What if you could kind of do that online with the internet? Wouldn't that be kind of cool? Right, that plus some other workflow integration and stuff like that, so you can deploy workflows. SQL Services, we had called it SQL Server Data Services, or SSDS. This is the new name for it, is SQL Services. Just think of a cloud version of SQL. It's SQL behind a set of web APIs. So I can create tables and insert and remove data and all the rest of that CRUD operations, et cetera. And then we have a couple of up-level kind of services. SharePoint itself for doing SharePoint kind of an online space, as well as the Dynamics and CRM. Excuse me. Okay. So we've announced a bunch of that new content in here. We have tooling for this as well. And so one of the things you may have seen if you watched Ray Ozzy's keynote on day 1 is the way you created a Windows Azure project. You just go into Visual Studio, file a new project, I want it on Azure. It automatically gives you both the web portion, which is what runs. It's just, think of it like an ASP.NET app is the easy way to think of it, as well as the deployment fabric piece, which is the configuration. How many CPUs do I want to actually install on? How many servers do I want? So you can start off very easily by writing one cloud app and saying, I just want it on one server. And if Jason's top site gets really, really popular, I can just go into the XML and say, why don't you give me 20 servers? And then boom. And then you'll be able to actually go ahead and use that. So again, all your skills that you've kind of built up by doing web programming or even Windows client programming, if a client asks you to do cloud, if your company asks you to do cloud, it's going to feel very, very familiar for you in the environment. Okay, so in summary, these are all the pieces that we've kind of talked about today, all the parallel computing, et cetera. We do have a couple of things, and we'll send the links out here so you can actually find these, so don't worry about writing them down. The bits that I showed you tonight are actually available off of the CTP. It is a VHD. It's quite large, but we've broken it up into multiple pieces. That's kind of nice, though, because you can download all of the content and actually stitch, it'll stitch it together for you, but now you can launch a VPC and try out Visual Studio and .NET 4 for yourself. These are pre-alpha bits, but go ahead and give them a try. As of last Monday, we actually posted a number, like 20 videos on new Visual Studio 10 offerings up on Channel 9, and they're up on our homepage. The first one was mine, which is kind of like an overview, kind of like the cruise director thing. This might be interesting, this might be interesting. And then we have details from the teams that have built the product. So the SharePoint stuff's up there, the web stuff is up there, everything that I showed you and more is up there as well. The keynote that I did last week in its entirety, including the full sets of demos that we have available, are also launched here, so you can watch the entire keynote if that's interesting to you. Beyond that, we have both on TechEd, MSDN, as well as we mentioned on Channel 9, all the videos and content available for you to take a look at it. So there's a bunch of rich material, so you can basically see everything that we've done there. So with that, I think what I'd like to do is say thank you, Ray, for inviting us for the Vista Squad. I appreciate the invitation here as well, and I guess we can do some Q&A. So thank you very much. Ray, do we have like maybe 5 minutes to do a couple questions, or
10 minutes would be.
Okay.
10 minutes? Okay, you just give me the hook, and we'll go from there. Okay.
All right.
Some good, interesting things there. Just a couple of questions, actually, while I get my chance. Web config transports, will you be able to do those, you could say, different database, different customers to notice you had debug and release there?
Yeah.
Whether you could actually set up your own different transports, say, right, I'm running on that server and these connections.
Yes, you can. It's a generic mechanism that's wired into the publishing part of the build, and then the transforms themselves are very generic. Think kind of regex sort of stuff, but with this other sort of syntax. And it's designed for exactly the scenario that you're talking about.
Yeah. And the second thing is the publish and deploy that you're having there. Is that fully integrated with sort of TFS build cycles, etc.?
Absolutely.
Extend all the IS7 build.
Yeah, it's just another work task that you can kind of schedule as part of the builds and things like that we've done. So if you're using like continuous check-ins and things like that, we also have a new feature I should mention, which is gated check-ins, which is part of interest. But yes, this falls out of exactly that. The gated check-ins feature is pretty cool, and it's something that we've done internally. Anybody ever broke the build? Yeah, it's just me. Oh, and Ray. Okay, Ray, it's just you and me on this one. Okay, you and me have screwed up web config. You and me have broken the build. So like I said, I've got several hundred developers, and it's one of those things where, look, if you've got like 280 people that are checking in code, if they only break the build once a year, you're pretty much broken every day, right? Which is a real problem. And it's a problem even if your team isn't quite that large, right? So gated check-ins, what we've done is we've introduced the ability that on check-in, you can actually kick off a workflow, and we do some stuff for you automatically. And what it'll do is go take your build, your like shelf set that you want to check in, and it'll go try it and actually do the builds and figure out, oh, you've got a build break in retail or something like that. We also have architectural validation. So if, for example, you've set rules that says the client tier is not allowed to write directly to the data tier, it must go through the middle tier instead, then with the Team Arch product, it will actually enforce that and come back and throw an error and say, you can't do that. You put the arc in the wrong place. That's a bad thing for you to do. I'm rejecting your check-in. Now it comes back to me, and I can look at it and go, oh, shoot, that's too bad. I can go fix it and then resubmit it. This is actually based on internal technology that we've been, wrote by ourselves. I used to run the CLR team, and by the time we added all the 64-bit targets, 32-bit, the SSCLI stuff, which ran on GCC, and then performance testing and stuff like that, it got to the point where I couldn't ask a team of developers to keep up with that. So we built these kind of internal mechanisms. Now we've taken that, and we've actually productized it as part of the product as well. So anyway, just a quick aside.
The parallel extensions, presumably, that they're just as useful when you're in a sort of single process above multi-threading environment where multi-threading would normally be a good option.
Yeah, here's the interesting question. I mean, it's useful any place where you'd like to get parallel. Well, and you can write this kind of code today yourself. I can go off and I can do create thread, and I can actually make that kind of code work. The interesting question is, typical ways that people will wind up, doing this work is like, oh, I want some parallelism. Let me go ahead and create some threads, right? So let me ask you this. If I have 8 cores on a machine, how many threads should I be running to get good kind of parallelism in it? 5, 10, any guesses? I'll tell you what typically happens in some of the code that I see is you keep doing create threads for the tasks that you have. And then what can happen is you might wind up with 16, 32, something like that. It's like, well, the correct number for execution is 8. Because there's really only going to be 8 physical threads that are running. Now that doesn't match how I want to actually write my code, however. I may want to queue up and run like 128 different tasks. It's just they're not all running at the same time. So today you might use I/O completion ports, you might use the thread pool and the CLR. There's these sorts of mechanisms. What we've done is tried to take those sort of environments and those decisions and say, why the heck do I care, right? I'll create a task needs to run, you figure out when to do it. We call this user mode scheduling, and so we actually do the scheduling for you. We'll actually do work stealing, we'll hijack from threads. I mean, there's a bunch of this kind of multi-threaded sort of scheduling logic that's built into the kernel. We've built it in at the user level and into these libraries so you don't have to go recreate that. And then we built the tooling environment on top of it to make it easy to consume.
Is there anything in there to aid in coordination between threads? A little bit easier.
Yeah, actually, because I mean the pattern that works the best in this environment is when you actually create tasks that are discrete and stateless for the most part, and you don't leak static types across the boundaries, for example. When you do that, then we can do the scheduling for you automatically. That's why the parallel link stuff is kind of cool, because when you think about it, link itself is just basically doing a functional lambda closure, right? And when you do that sort of thing, if you write it, it's naturally kind of giving you side effect free code, which means that we can go off and schedule it freely without side effects. So it's a cool and easy, because Link itself is, I don't know about you, but the thing I really love about Link is I've written functional language code, and it has that feature too. But unless you really like Lisp, or you really like Haskell, or you like these sorts of languages, they're kind of obtuse, to program against, or maybe it's just me, but so Link itself gives me that capability, and then it works quite well for scheduling. Oop, sorry. Hi.
Is there a simplistic way of running the testing tools that you just showed us, the testing framework, etc., instead of going through Visual Studio and teaching the testers to do all of that? Could we expect someday in the future to have it integrated in the OS itself and just shooting an email with the bug and attachment as a recording?
Yeah. Well, I think that, so what the product that we've enabled, and Matt showed this in the video, it's a new product called codename Commando. That won't be the final name, but that kind of outer environment where he was running the test lab stuff. You saw he also did testing and planning and that kind of stuff. That environment itself is designed for the tester specifically to go through and do the recording and things like that. So for this particular, excuse me, for this particular version of the product, we're just doing it on the testing side, and we've done integration with System Center on the management side for the virtual machine state and stuff like that. But it's not too hard to imagine what you're describing in the future as like, wow, okay, now you've got enough, you can record videos, you can record historical debugging and stuff like that. Might I want that for a help desk or something? I mean, those sorts of things. We're not actually announcing anything along those lines here yet. We want to start really by getting rid of this no repro thing and working very closely with test and dev first. But yeah, I hear where you're heading. It's a totally legitimate question. Back there.
You started putting some UML modeling type facilities into Visual Studio.
Yes.
How rich or how fully featured do you expect that to be by the time you launch?
Well, we've done a couple of things here. The first one, and unfortunately we didn't have enough time to demo it, but we have a bunch of it online. We've added an Architectural Explorer view, which is something new, along with the SharePoint Explorer and a few other new explorers. The Architectural Explorer, what it does, it actually walks all of your assemblies inside of your project, and it looks for all the dependencies across the entire system. And you might have saw the little snapshot with the kind of grid, or the kind of tree view up there. It literally can show you the links and arcs between all of the assemblies. If you double click on one of those, I can go inside and see the class diagram, which is what was showed on the slide. It is a snapshot. So we've got all that support built in now. The nice thing about that is it works directly off your binaries. You don't have to do anything special. We just go crack the metadata and go read all of it. Now, the other thing that we have, and I didn't show here, is sequence diagrams. And so I can, inside of my source code, right-click and say generate sequence diagram. What that'll do is go through all my source code, et cetera, and figure out, well, what is the sequence of operations that I'm doing? How do items interrelate with each other so I can actually see how my code is structured? That uses UML 2.1.1 in order to accomplish that, and now you can get that kind of diagramming in there. So that's the basic part of where we've got for right now, and we're adding a whole bunch of other support for UML after that, and that's all going into the team architecture product for the next version. You ready? Oh, that was the one more?
That was the cut.
Okay, so that was the one more. If anybody's got another question.
Yeah, with Visual Studio 2010, being based on WPF and the text rendering at small font sizes, have you guys done a bunch of work to make it clearer?
So there's a couple of things we've got. In this particular thing, Visual Studio itself is a classic hybrid application. And so, for example, I've got C++ code, C# code, et cetera. In the build that you see here, the editor itself was WPF. Some of the tree views and stuff that you're seeing aren't yet. And so the small fonts off to the right that were a little bit harder to read, those are still in Win forms, which is how we wrote the application originally. What you should expect by the time we're through to our betas and our final release is those will be replaced with WPF as well. I didn't actually show this because I don't have a mouse with a scroll wheel, but one of the cool things you should try when you get the new editor is hold down the control key and the scroll wheel. We can scroll out infinitely because we have vector graphics for the libraries. In fact, one of the cool things we have is a document map margin. It scrolls your entire text buffer into the size of like a postage stamp or an oyster pass, about yay big, right? And with that, you can click on a particular thing. We'll highlight all the keyword references and that kind of stuff. You can see what it looks like. So that's a kind of a long way around of saying we will have WPF everywhere, which will fix some of the font stuff. The second part, which I think is closer to what you were asking, is what about the perf and readability? We are working on some of those things as well. A lot of it's kind of the remoting and those sort of pieces. And then part of it's just running on a laptop, Hyper-V, and the barcode kind of display. But yeah, we're adding a whole bunch of stuff in there. Cool. All right, we'll get you after the break. Thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you.